Um, Good morning, everyone. I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this online conversation from the lands of the Camaragal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands in which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting, and the First Nations people across Canada. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales and elsewhere in Australia, and across the broad expanses of Canada. I also welcome our colleagues from Canada. It's good to have you return. Today is our third symposium for 2021. The first one was on student wellbeing, the second on academic and professional staff wellbeing, and today's is on belonging in practice. The QUILT results published recently in Australia indicate student ratings of the quality of their entire educational experience among undergraduates fell sharply from 78% in 2019 to 69% in 2020, a fall of 9 percentage points. There are also substantial falls in student positive ratings of learner engagement from 60% in 2019 to 44% in 2020, and of learning resources from 84% in 2019 to 76% in 2020. There were smaller falls in positive ratings for student support, skills development, and teaching quality. It's worth looking at these data if you haven't done so already. Bond University has been consistent in its high rankings for students. Perhaps we can learn something from Bond and what they're doing. Over 400 people have registered for our webinar today. Creating the conditions to facilitate student belonging is a challenge, but also a central responsibility of what we do in any education system. Today, we will hear how 4 quite different institutions have responded to build a sense of belonging and the practical responses that have been put in place. So the session today is organised with an introduction, and then I will ask each member a question that will last about 35 minutes. Then questions will be taken from the audience, and if you're lucky, I will attempt to bring it together at the end, and that will take about 5 minutes. The symposium will be recorded for others to listen to later. Let me now introduce our panel. But before we get to the questions, can I ask each of you to provide us with some background in your experience regarding the development of student belonging? And I invite Emeritus Professor Beverley Oliver to speak first.
Thank you, Judith. Good morning, fellow panelists and everyone who's joined us. It's great to be back on Zoom again, which is the whole new world, isn't it, really? Once upon a time, we would have got on a plane, flown somewhere and talked and gone away. And now look what we do, which is pertinent to the subject today. Look, I have an affiliation with Deakin University. I'm the former Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education at Deakin University, but I need to make it clear that I no longer speak for or on behalf of Deakin University, as I'm not actively employed there. So Judith, really, for the last 2 years since I gave up full-time work, I've been more of an observer and a researcher, and if you like, a commentator, I guess, on these matters, not so much at the helm. So I just wanted to make that clear to the group. But I have an enduring passion for education, and particularly for the fully online learner. And I'll talk more about this shortly, but I'm very interested in how we make learning possible as possible for the person who elects to learn online. I know a lot's happened since the pandemic, and a lot of people went online who weren't expecting to go online, which I imagine is some of the background to those QUILT data. But if fully online is the default, which I think it now will be more often, how do we actually make sure that those people have the optimal circumstances for learning? I'll leave it there. That's my little introduction. I'll come back.
Thank you. Gavan, can I invite you to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, everyone, or good evening for my, or late afternoon for my Canadian counterparts. My name is Gavan Watson, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm coming to you today from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, and specifically the city of St. John's. The image over my shoulder is in fact Cape Spear, which is the most eastern point in North America and about a 20-minute drive from my house. This photograph was taken maybe 2 months ago with my drone, which is not relevant to what we're talking about today. But I hold a dual role at Memorial University, where I am the Associate Vice President, Teaching and Learning. And I'm also the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning on St. John's campus. And those two pieces are relevant for the experience that I bring to the table, as I've been a online educator for almost 20 years now. So I have the lived experience of being in the online classroom, but I'm also working with faculty members across the institution to enhance their teaching practices when it comes to online, in-person, and blended learning. And then ultimately, I'm also attempting to support the institution as we create meaningful learning experiences and a sense of belonging for our students. So it's a pleasure to be here and share my experiences and the experiences of my institution.
Sherman.
Thanks, Judith. My name's Sherman Young. I'm the interim DVC Education at RMIT University, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the East Kulin Nations, on whose unceded land RMIT conducts the business of the university, and pay my respect to ancestors and elders past, present, and emerging from those peoples. I'm coming to you from Melbourne in Australia. That is not Melbourne in my background. That's actually a bit of coastline in Sydney, because that's my, I suppose that's where I spent most of my kind of adult life around Coogee in Sydney. My disciplinary background is not education, but it's kind of media and cultural studies with a real research interest in the impact of digital technologies. I'm particularly interested in that intersection of student experience and digital cultures. And what can we learn from the 25, 30 years of the internet and everything that has emerged in that time period, in that different type of engagement across not just learning, but our broader social and wider life. As far as RMIT is concerned, our approach is really going to have to be blended. I mean, I take the point that, you know, more and more students are going to be moving online, but our unpacking of the quilt data is very much that our students wanted that learner engagement face-to-face. They missed desperately that opportunity to talk to and meet and engage with other students in a physical environment. And they also missed our resources. That learner resource score that you mentioned, Judith, that was quite a dramatic change for us. And we saw very clearly that you know, whether it's the big engineering labs or the studios that we have, they were things that our students really missed. And so for me, moving forward, how do we get that sense of belonging in that blended mode where both online and physical need to be engaging, where both of them are opportunities for our students, and they're both opportunities that all of our students want to engage with? That's me.
Thank you. And Chris, with your gorgeous Sydney sunset.
Yes. Thank you, Judith. So hello, everyone. Super excited to be with you today. I'm Prof Tisdell. I'm a professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Education for me is like a vocation. It's been a very strong voice within me calling since I was young. I'm a bit like Gavan. I've been teaching online for a long time too. I think I established one of Australia's earliest YouTube channels dedicated to learning mathematics 13 years ago. I segue nicely in from Sherman's comments as well, because for the last 2 years, I've been running a research project on how teachers can embed community, whether it's face-to-face, blended, or online. So I'm super excited to be sharing some of that with you today. Excellent.
So let's start with the business of today. And my first question is really for all of you, and it's a Dorothy Dixer. And the question is, have there been any unexpected or unanticipated benefits from COVID-19 pandemic around building community and belonging amongst students? So Gavan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things that when we think about belonging, I believe that we're talking about students finding a place and a space for their participation and feeling valued within the classroom, whatever that classroom looks like. And I would say that one of the unexpected benefits around building community that I've seen at our institution, but elsewhere throughout the pandemic, is the notion that equity deserving students can access learning spaces in ways and shapes that they have not been able to do so before, and able to participate in learning experiences in such a way that is to their benefit. We're hearing, as we're considering what our resumption of on-campus learning will look like, that we don't want to, that there are students who have access, like physical disabilities and physical access concerns, and they're concerned about having to return back to an inaccessible campus. And so I would say that I would want to highlight that notion around increased flexibility where community is built, and increased access as for those equity deserving students.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
Yeah, it's a great question, Judyth. I agree with what Gavin's already mentioned. So let me tease that out a bit. So we were faced with the situation where our own institution and also nationally, we were asked about fostering senses of community, and people didn't really know how to do it at that program and course and that classroom level. So that was one of the motivations for driving our research. And just to go on from what Gavin mentioned, for us, when we talk about community, what do we actually mean? Well, there's three dimensions in our opinion. One is sort of, I guess, three ships, right? One is membership. I feel like I'm a part of something. A partnership. So we're in this together. We're learning together. And the third one is ownership. Students taking control of their own learning and their own learning trajectory. So once we worked that out, we were looking at basic pedagogical experiments, both face-to-face and online, and we could compare them. Now, you mentioned if there are any benefits to come out of these things with COVID before, Judyth, getting back to your original question. Look, I was very excited to try community fully online. It's always been a bit of a fringe activity for many universities in Australia. I just wish that we didn't have to go through a pandemic to get there. And it's interesting when you compare the two things. Some things that work face-to-face will also work online. But the question is what's same and what's different? But I'll pass back to you, Judyth.
Okay. Bev.
Well, as I said, Judyth, I've been more of an observer than someone actively engaged. However, my reflections would be that, you can't make assumptions and group statements about everyone, because the student body is actually very diverse. So if we think of the people who were in many Australian universities who were already studying at a distance or fully online, and as we all know in the Australian context, it's very different. Some universities are very much into online learning already, others not so much at all. I'm sure it's the same in Canada. So the people who had already elected to study online saw very little difference, I would imagine. Then I would say there's a second group of people who were in disciplines which don't require a lot of face-to-face interaction. I take Sherman's point about the engineering labs, and there'd be medical labs and others. And that is the sticking point. Actually trying to emulate that all of a sudden online would have been very difficult. But that's not everybody. So a lot of people who were studying on campus in fully what I would call sort of discursive subjects like business, arts, for example, there'd be lots of people who could switch to the online. They might not have liked it. It might not have been great. But again, they would have had a pretty similar experience. And I would just finish by saying, Judyth, that in my experience previously at Deakin, the fully on-campus students often acted like the fully online students anyway. Students were very transactional. They did not necessarily want to drive for 2 hours to campus, lose the will to live finding a parking spot, and then schlep into a lecture theatre to sit and listen to someone when they could have actually stayed in bed and done the same thing. So, I would be a little provocative and say, I think a lot of students were doing the fully online learning anyway, or pretty much, And it was more the universities who were surprised when the pandemic came along rather than the students. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And Sherman?
A couple of observations I've always made about the internet are that firstly, it tends to make the invisible visible. And secondly, it acts as an amplifier or an accelerator of things. And what COVID did was really highlight those two characteristics, if you like. There was a lot of activity, to Bev's point, that we probably knew was happening around our student behaviour and our student engagement. And all of a sudden, because we had to shift to remote, distance and online learning, it was pretty apparent that those behaviours were always happening, and now we had to actually confront them and address them in a proper and engaging way. I also go back to, you know, some of us are old enough to remember the early days of the internet, and Howard Rheingold wrote a seminal book called Virtual Community back in the early 90s, where he wrote about perhaps the first online community, the world, excuse me, which was the whole Earth electronic link. And it was arguably the world's first online community in the first place where you could actually examine that sense of belonging in the online space. And he drew on sociologist Mark Smith's kind of ideas around, well, what are the capitals that create that community? And kind of in parallel to Chris's three ships, there was the idea of a social network capital, a knowledge capital, and a communion. So you know, what are we doing online to understand how that community works in the context of learning, in the further context that what students are doing now in their learning space is something that has been built from that virtual community thinking right through their life on the internet. So again, as Bev said, this is nothing new for students. They've been living online for 15 and 20 years. They've been engaging online. It's the universities that have to really understand how to use and take advantage and properly engage the students in that space that we're not probably as good as we should be.
So given that point that you're saying that students have, this has been part of students' lived experience for a long time, that in fact we in universities are the ones that have had to catch up. What are some of the characteristics that you've seen in terms of this catch up, in terms of universities' responses? And I'll throw that question back to you, Sherman, because you sort of provoked it, because it's not on my script.
I love to go off script. So look, a little bit of anecdata. So my daughter's in third year science at Chris's university, actually. And we were talking about, well, what was the experience like? Because she went through that COVID thing, and she actually came home for 3 months and studied entirely online. And then she went back on campus, and she said, oh, it's great to be back in the labs, but I hope I never have to go to a face-to-face lecture again. And I hope that they stay online. And you know, that mirrors, I mean, I think you go back 5 or 6 years, and Marnie did some work at ANU, and others have done work around the sector. We know that kind of big lecture experience is not something that many students engage with, but we have persisted. We have continued to think that is what the delivery of education at universities should be. And it's everything from the vocabulary we use. I mean, we call our teachers lecturers. And we continue to see in the press, the minister says, oh, lectures must come back on campus. But, you know, that's a clear example of where the students are telling us, and have been telling us for a very long time, that that's not working. Can you please rethink that? And now we're saying, okay, well, maybe we can rethink it. And it's probably not as simple as just saying, well, let's chunk it up into 6-minute bits and throw it online. There's probably more nuance and more understanding and more thinking we need to bring to that conversation. But it is, to me, a real trigger and a real example of, okay, the students have been there for a while, we haven't.
Okay. Gavan, what's the Canadian perspective?
Well, I would say that what's interesting, just building on what Sherman mentioned, was that understanding where students are is obviously a really important place to be. I'm also cognizant of the fact that when we were orienting students who had never taken an online course before to the online learning environment, there was kind of an assumption that they were literate and able to use the tools and technologies to their advantage. And what we really found was that they require that kind of orientation and support to get started with those tools. So support and orientation is still a very important part of this transition. And I don't think we ought to, though we have learners, especially at the undergraduate level, who may have engaged in community and build connections with friends and peers through online social networks. I don't think we can assume that they're equally as capable without some direction from us to do that in a similar kind of learning environment. And so I think just being aware of the notion that they're going to require guidance from us, and that they're going to require our support to be able to make those connections. Sherman, you weren't making that allusion. I'm drawing that to a conclusion. I think the risk is that we assume that because they've got literacy and comfortability with a number of online social networks, that they can sort of translate that kind of learning experience to the online classroom. And I think it takes very distinct and direct facilitation from educators in order for community to occur.
Chris, from somebody who, actually works with students, takes classes and the like, what's your perspective in terms of how universities have responded? Yeah,
another great question, Judyth. Thank you. Look, we all had to shift very quickly. And I think there were a huge flurry of emails. What do I, from other staff, probably including myself, what do I do? How do I do it? Something's not working. And of course the students are experiencing this too. It's not just staff. Some of the successful strategies that we saw in actually building community involved 4 or 5 dimensions, right? One was, and I think universities have done these reasonably well in general. So one of them was building in flexibility. So being understanding, I know many universities last year had ultra flexible grading systems, timelines, those sorts of things. At a more sort of micro level, friendliness is more important than ever. That sort of pedagogical warmth that you get, in the classroom, just sometimes by being around other people, but also how do you translate that through screens? That's super important. One of the advantages that we've seen when you do have Zoom meetings, you can see everybody's name. You can have 200 people there. You can see everyone's name. So even just simple techniques like referring to people by name when they make comments or talk in your classes. So friendliness, huge thing. Interactivity, getting a dialogue going, creating that peer-to-peer dialogue as well as teacher to student dialogue. Being encouragement, I guess that being encouraging, I guess that goes back to friendliness as well. And also being supportive, not just as a teacher or as somebody who facilitates learning, but encouraging the students to seek out supportive mechanisms, whether it's academic or whether it's psychological or something else. One of the really important things I think that we can try to do is to normalize help seeking. So there are 4 or 5 strategies that we've seen, Judyth, that have really helped in our studies on building community. So it's not just build community, it's like, what are some practical things that we can do to actually, on the ground, so to speak, to really foster that sense of community.
And Bev, what are your observations from outside? Looking across the horizon and across the field of play.
Well, I'll share with you, Judyth, and colleagues, that when I did finish full-time work at the end of 2018, one of the things I did early in 2019 was I joined this community myself. I actually enrolled in an online degree at an Australian university. So I did it for personal interest and I just wanted to learn stuff. It was a pretty dismal experience, I have to say. And, it was dismal because as a learner, no one really bothered to find out who I was, what I already knew, and what I wanted to get out of this course now. And so I'd like to bring to the conversation a slightly different lens, and that is that we need to think of these people as learners. Universities should be for the lifelong learning of the nation. And yet when we do come to talk about these issues, we talk about students, and I I assume in our heads, we often think of the 18-year-old. We just talked a minute ago about how familiar they are with technology, and we know they're not all. But the lifespan learner, you know, in the Australian sector goes from 16 years of age is about our youngest student and to someone in their 80s. So there are lots of people, if you do the analysis, in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And at some universities, for example, I heard the Vice-Chancellor a few years ago of UNE, University of New England, talking about their typical learner who was a 33-year-old mother of 2, if not 3 children. Well, she might have 3 next year, and that's why she's attrited. And I thought that was very telling. So I think what we have to do, whether our students are fully online, partly online, or whatever, is we actually have to figure out who these learners are. And it will be different by discipline, cohort, university. They're different groups of people. Find out who they are and then actually ask them what they want. Because quite frankly, I wasn't looking for a community when I signed up to learn. It was a personal interest subject I wanted to learn. I wanted more engagement with the teaching staff, quite frankly. I wanted decent feedback on my assessment. And in the end, I decided I wasn't getting it. I got a rubric, you know, with crosses on it telling me about my essay. And I thought, this is not worth it. This is too expensive and too time consuming. So there you are as a personal experience of one of our learners, and I'm only one person and other people would want different things. But I think it's important to do that research and then ask your learners, what is it that helps and hinders your learning? What do you want to achieve? How can we deliver it? And are we delivering it? End of rant.
Yeah, no, and good questions. And I think that they are questions about student engagement, but they're also questions about accountability and to whom are we accountable? And I think that's something that's often not really talked about. Chris, can I start off the next question with drawings from some of the research that you did? And you referred to in your research, Allen et al.'s 2016 research about teacher behaviour has an impact on students' sense of belonging and sense of community in the classroom. And this in fact picks up a bit on what you were saying, Bev. Does this experience support or contradict Allen et al.'s view? And what have you observed in practice about the behaviour of the teacher and the response of students?
Yeah, look, I'm probably a bit biased here, Judyth. You know, there's this position in education that teachers are no longer important, and you know, you've moved from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side to the, you know, the peer at the rear, so to speak, which is something that I disagree with. I think that the last 12 months have shown that teachers have never been more important. Because they're so much of a source of inspiration and support to learners everywhere. We found that there are things that teachers can do. And what we've looked at is to try to bridge that gap between create community to actually, well, how do you do that? We looked at strategies that everybody could do. Like it's no use having these strategies if nobody can feel that they can implement them. So those are some of the things that were going through our minds when we were doing this research. It's interesting you mentioned that paper though. If you look in the research, one of the biggest factors on a student satisfaction is the relationship between the learners and their teacher, and that's well known. I mean, you know, that's like I'm just going to say it. So so that's, some people will not want to hear that, but that's pretty important. Back to you.
In fact, we've got an anonymous attendee, and Gavan, you're going to make a comment to this question that having videos on, and if you've got a video on, you can create a sense of community and a sense of engagement and a sense of visibility and a sense of place. But without the videos on, you've got a blank screen. And that, I'm sure, has an impact on the ability to create a sense of belonging. Gavan, do you want to respond to that?
I would just, I'll respond to that by saying that having the video on creates a certain kind of belonging. And I think it recreates, it's us looking to recreate what we'd expect a classroom community to look like in the face-to-face environment, where you can look out across the entire swath of your lecture hall and see everybody there. And that feels normal and that feels good. And I think the moment that we shifted to online and remote, that sort of grounding disappeared. And what became implicit suddenly became unique and unexpected. And I would just say that whenever I'm talking about teaching and designing for online learning, it's not simply taking and making analogous experiences, taking the lecture hall and reproducing it online. It's about considering the affordances of the technology and then coupling that with what it is that you want to achieve as an educator and trying to find new stuff. So specifically with video, I think that, so like I said, it allows for a certain kind of engagement, but I would say that there's lots of different ways to foster meaningful engagement that don't require synchronous time and place, where everybody needs to be stuck in a chair, looking at a screen and going and kind of like serial one by one talking. I think that that's really relatively reductive. And I think the tools and technologies that we have access to quite possibly create other ways of facilitating that kind of engagement. And just that I would say that as others have mentioned in the chat, students are not turning their video on because they've been put into unexpected places due to the pandemic, i.e. they're studying at home, they don't want to show the environment that they're in, in this particular paper, and what I've heard anecdotally, generally speaking, seems to affect those students for whom there are other, first generation students that identify as requiring different kinds of support. It's an uneven, it creates an uneven playing field. So I just think that maybe that's my soapbox, that we just need to also consider the other ways of fostering engagement.
Sherman?
Yeah, I'm just going to begin by thinking about what Gavan says, because I totally agree. It's like, we tend to kind of try and recreate what we're used to in the online environment, whereas the real challenge is to come up with something innovative and new and more appropriate for the affordances that the new technologies enable us and allow us to do. And I can't help but think we're kind of like pretty early in the journey for learning. And there's a comment in the chat about, I'll paraphrase here, about how archaic the LMS is. And I totally agree. Every time I hop into Canvas or Moodle, with all due respect to colleagues in Canvas and in Instructure and Moodle rooms, it feels like stepping back into the 90s. And it's like, we really need to be thinking about, well, how can we use this opportunity to build new capabilities, as well as draw on the ones that are available to us on those existing platforms. I will note that, online communities have not traditionally relied on video. That's a fairly recent thing. We've been building communities online for a long time that have been textually based and really rich communities that have been textually based. Granted, the continuum of time and connection is different often from the classroom experience and what we think of as the traditional university experience, but it does give us the experience, if you like, of saying, well, you can do this. What are the ways that we can build community? Is it around shared interest? Is it around setting up activities? Is it around finding ways to even intersperse a textual or engagement online that's fairly simple with a richer physical one in a regular basis? Is there a way to do that in a slightly different formulation than, to Gavan's point, simply trying to replicate, here is a classroom and let's try and do the classroom online? I have to say, Judyth, I've forgotten what the question is. So can you remind me?
If that was the answer, that was the question.
Okay.
No. Look, there's a comment here that somebody has made, and there have been a few articles in the last few weeks, one from the Sydney Morning Herald yesterday, effectively saying universities are dying. Do you agree? If so, is it because of the lack of engagement, as Beverley says, or something more systemic? I'm inclined to agree with the articles, but I think it's quite a slow demise as people start learning differently. Anybody want to make a comment on that observation made by Anonymous?
I'll have a go, Judyth.
Thank you.
I don't think universities are dying. and I don't think they will die in a hurry, but they are under a great deal of pressure. I would also want to take a moment to actually acknowledge, you know, the dreadful circumstances that people had to work within in the last year or so, particularly in universities worldwide and definitely in Australia. I mean, industrially and so on. And, you know, it's testament to people that the business is still operating, if I can put that in inverted commas. I think politically in Australia, universities are certainly under scrutiny. I won't say attack. The government is clearly not friendly with universities at the moment. But I think as educators and researchers, the best thing we can do is buckle down and do what we're passionate about and the core business of a university. And that is about making sure people have a good learning experience, that they're successful at what they're trying to do, and that we keep creating new knowledge. So I would just try to be a little optimistic about that and say, you know, these things come and go. This too will pass, as they say. And this is an opportunity, though, if you are working in a university, to think very hard about what your real mission is and to focus on doing that really, really well. And crises are often a very good opportunity for innovation and for doing things better. So try to see the upside.
Yeah. Anybody else want to respond to Anonymous?
I'll have a shot there, Judyth. I tend to agree with Beverley. It's like university's been around for a very long time, and the notion that they're dying is probably better recast as they are going through a period of reinvention and a revalidation of their mission and their purpose in the community. If you go back to the early days of the university, I think the original mantra of Bologna was a community of scholars, and building on that, it's kind of evolved and developed into the modern research university, which we all enjoy and engage with now. Is the current formulation going to be the one which, you know, endures for the next 50 years? Perhaps not, but I have faith that there will remain a community of scholars which continues to educate and continues to develop new knowledge. And so I don't think it's dead, but I think it's probably, again, to Bev's point, time for kind of a bit of a reassessment and a reevaluation of exactly what the university is.
Is it a version of that Mark Twain aphorism, news of my death is greatly exaggerated?
Yeah, and you know, we're academics, so we simply redefine what death is.
Okay. Gavan, do you want to make a comment?
No, I don't need to take the floor. I've responded to somebody's question about the impact of what the future of online is in regards to students' learning experiences during the pandemic. I don't know. I think I've made my point there.
Okay. Chris, can I get back to your research on community and belonging? And you talk about, and somebody asked for these to be revised again. So your three ships, membership, partnership, and ownership, which I think is not only a wonderful group of three, but a clever play on words. Can you describe how they work to create a sense of belonging? And second, what were the big themes that emerged from your research? And what suggestions can you make to our participants in building communities on campus and in the ether?
Yeah, they're all great. A big suite of questions there, so I'll do my best. You know, I see the membership, the partnership, and the ownership as sort of levels of community here, right? So you know, you sort of you want to get to that first stage where people feel like they belong, that they're a part of something, that they're a member of something, and then, you know, the next level up in that model would be a partnership where you know, these students are working together. You know, I'm part of something, and then the third one would be ownership, where this is like the highest level in that model. You know, this is my course, or this is my learning trajectory, or something like that. So to me, they're the three stages of community. And it's hard to do the ownership if you don't actually get the membership first. So that's it. And how do you do it? I mean, a lot of institutions and a lot's written in the research field about, oh, we should be creating community. There's a disconnect between that sort of a message and actually teaching staff on the ground trying to do it. And that's a well-known gap. So we think that it's got challenges, but it's doable. One of the key things that we discovered was that part of this was giving up some of the control and the rigidness of the way lecturers and tutors and professors teach. Students, in our study, students had a lot of choice when certain material was covered, what preparation was done, when assessments were done. And this seemed to really give our students a sense of a control over situations and choice. And that sort of goes back to the flexibility that I mentioned earlier. And I mentioned things like pedagogical warmth, teachers actually being friendly and being supportive of their classes. And so what our study showed was there are 4 or 5 practical activities that pretty much any teacher can do in their own way that can foster that sense of community. And the research timeline for us is 2 years. We actually had a year before COVID and a year during COVID. And so from a timing perspective with comparisons, that was quite handy. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the comparison? The data that we got and the feedback that we got actually didn't vary greatly. We just had to rethink how do you display pedagogical warmth in a Zoom meeting rather than in a face-to-face classroom. So there's some of the takeaways that we had.
Okay. Look, a number of people have brought up the idea of friendships, and that one of the values of being on campus is that you can hang out with your friends. And so Sheila Chang makes this comment: one of the outcomes of the lecture theatre face-to-face tutorials is engagement between the students. Friendships are made and friendships are enhanced. How do you think we can emulate the student-to-student engagement, which is one of the greatest strengths and outcomes of a campus experience? And then earlier, somebody referred to their daughter's experience at Monash, and during that first year, this person's daughter made no friends. So how can we create friendships for students in this environment? Gavan, did you?
I have a bit of an idea. Create friendships. I think we need to be aware of the fact that when we're talking about the lecture theatre as a space where students can engage with one another and discover each other and connect, that we're talking about third spaces. So it's not, we're talking about like the study space in between classrooms, or like what I like to call the informal office hours that tend to occur at the end of a lecture. And it's about considering that there's really a loss of that, and has been a loss of those kinds of third spaces, collision spaces, at least from my perspective, given that and I must say from the Canadian perspective, our entire academic year has been remote or online. There's been no, with very few notable exceptions, very, very little on-campus learning. So students haven't had that back and forth. So what do we do there? A gifted educator that I saw this year actually they would have their synchronous online lecture for an hour, and then they stuck around and conducted their office hours right after the lecture. And what they discovered happened there was that students stayed on and engaged with one another. It was the informal space, because as we're all familiar with coming into Zoom meetings, especially Zoom lectures, there's often quiet, it's nothing, crickets are chirping. But by facilitating that kind of space and providing, the instructor also provided very clear directions about what this time was going to be about, and that it was a place for students to engage with one another. That was one way that, I don't want to describe that as friendships per se, but it was a way of creating that third space. The other piece that I would just say is that where students are doing this themselves, and much perhaps to the consternation of some academics, and that is that they're using tools like Discord. And these are non-LMS tools where students, again, back to that notion of like students are using a suite of tools that they're already familiar with. And so they're using a tool like Discord to connect with one another. And I would just say that perhaps it makes sense to engage with those students, not to say don't use those, not use the Discords to have a conversation about the class, but just ask, ensure that there's respectful conversation happening there, that there's, academic integrity, the philosophy of academic integrity is being upheld. And if that's the case, if there's respectful conversations and academic integrity is being upheld, maybe there's ways that you can support those communities that are existing outside the learning management system.
So does that mean that you need to create boundaries, but you also need to articulate expectations and protocols is the wrong word, but expectations about how people are to engage and how people are to manage interactions with, themselves, but also with their teachers?
Yes. So I would simply say that a core tenet that I have of my teaching is that I always tell students what it is that I'm doing and why it is that I'm doing it. I'm always unpacking my assumptions and explaining why I'm doing something and how I'd like to see something. That just continues. I don't think we can necessarily assume that the students are going to foster connections with one another or understand why they're in small groups without some kind of really clear direction on our part.
Can I just add there, yeah. Judith? I think Gavan is absolutely right about that third space, and universities have been doing that in different ways for a very long time in the what you might call the informal learning space, the learning that's not recognised, and the social experiences, the clubs and societies, all of that the student life parts of the universities have always done really well. And I suspect a lot of friendships and, dare I say it, partnerships and lifelong relationships have begun out of those kind of activities. Certainly in COVID, we highlighted those activities for our students and made them far more visible. For example, esports got a huge run last year. It became quite a big thing where, we couldn't be doing the inter-varsity sports as well, but, there was a very big esports kind of engagement, for example, and our other clubs and societies ran really hard and managed to build their communities online in a way that they previously had done on campus. So I think, those experiences are there. They do need support. They do need recognition, I would argue, that, we need to find a way to encourage students to participate and to understand that, maybe if I'm the president of the Indian Student Society, it's actually a really good learning thing for me. And we will, as a university, understand and recognise that and help you put that on your CV, et cetera, as part of everything you've learned, even though it may have been informal rather than formal.
Bev or Chris, do you want to make a comment?
I wouldn't mind jumping in. Sorry, Chris. Just to be, again, a little provocative, I'm really sorry to hear that the person whose daughter didn't make any friends on campus, but I think we have to be careful not to assume that this is because of the mode. 1 year, 2 year, 5 years ago, there were a lot of lonely people on campus. It's not all beer and Skittles for everyone. And, it's very hard to track who actually comes onto a campus and what they do and whether they really are having a good time. So yes, a small group of people, I think, do engage in the clubs and societies. My sense is most people don't these days. However, the other thing is, many people engage digitally anyway. Many people have friends on, the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Instagrams that they've never met, and they have a virtual relationship with them. So we can't assume that the university has to do everything for learners. Learners are generally adults, or at least, approaching adulthood and well into adulthood. So they usually have good ways of connecting with people anyway. Not everyone does, but I'm saying it can't all be down to the university. I think what we have to be careful of is thinking and this is something I've had to think about as I've gone through my career, I can't just keep thinking university for a learner today is what I experienced when I was 18 on campus at UWA last century. It's just not like that anymore. And life is not like that. You know, that was before the mobile phone was invented. I know that's a shock to everyone, but, you know, it wasn't as easy to stay in touch with people then. It wasn't as easy to engage if you weren't on the campus. I didn't necessarily have a car. I didn't have a lot of money. So, you know, my social life was confined to going onto campus, but people's social life is not confined to going on a campus anymore. People live blended lives. We all do. So look at us now. We're not on a physical place, but we're all really engaging, and we've got a lot of people engaging with us online. So I guess what I'm trying to say is let's be careful not to canonize the old on-campus mode, because it wasn't that great for a lot of people for a lot of the time.
Chris?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I just wanted to echo what Gavan, Sherman, and Beverley have said. The Discord pages are great. I know my students tell me that when there's an online class going on, they actually have this Discord webpage community interaction open on one part of their screen, and hopefully the lecture open on the other. So they're doing things in the background. The making friends angle is super interesting. How much do you engineer that, and how much do you sort of let that evolve on its own? I think it's probably a little of both. I know when I was Associate Dean in the Faculty of Science, we had this introductory science course. Basically, the course was about making friends, or at least that's how the students would describe it to us. But not everybody has those opportunities. I think also when you're online or doing some sort of live stream class as a student, you can come out of your shell a bit more. And I say that as someone who works in mathematics. We're all introverts, if you don't know. So you don't have to stand up in front of a class of 300 people to ask a question. You can type it in the chat. And you can reach out to other people, as others have already mentioned, online. So I don't have the answers, but it's a super interesting question. How much do you engineer friendships, and how much do you sort of let it evolve naturally?
There was a question here from Leanne McCann, which is, I think, interesting. And she makes the comment, this disruption has created forced opportunities for innovation, cross-culture and cross-discipline collaboration, as well as listening to the students to improve global engagement and belonging. The challenge is to hear from those students who do not provide feedback, but a treat. Agility is essential. Human interaction is critical. Any thoughts? You're all collecting your thoughts.
Look, I think this goes back in some ways to a point I made earlier, that in some ways this has always been the case. The challenge has always been to engage with those students with diverse, I suppose, cultural experiences and global experiences. And again, what we've got now is a greater visibility of the opportunity to do that. Drawing on what Chris was saying, you know, the online technologies do have different affordances, and they do allow us to engage with different cohorts in more sensitive and more nuanced ways. So I think, Leanne, you're absolutely right. We perhaps haven't thought through exactly how we might target those groups as well as we could. You know, those who are able can use tools like Discord and, you know, the subreddits and everything to go mad, but there will be others who aren't so literate and aren't so capable of doing that. How do we provide the support and the opportunity for those students? And I think this is the discussion, you know, at what point does the university intervene? At what point does it allow the students to just get on with it? And I think, Leanne, you're telling us, or you're asking us, to be that place for those students who aren't capable of doing that for themselves. And I think that's right. And we need to find those tools and those mechanisms to support those students.
And have you got any idea of what those mechanisms and tools might look like?
So some of the things that we've been looking at are peer mentoring opportunities, really finding ways for the students to connect with each other in ways that can happen online that used to happen perhaps face to face. Am I allowed to use platform names on this forum, or is this like?
Yeah, of course.
You know, we're using.
It's not the ABC.
We're using LIGO, for example, to start to set up those peer-to-peer mentoring opportunities. We're exploring kind of opportunities around social learning so that the learning is more student-enabled rather than directed by teachers. All of those kind of bottom-up opportunities hopefully will give voice to those who perhaps may not be able to have voice otherwise.
Anybody else want to make a comment on that? Earlier, Amanda George made the comment about, I loved teaching online in COVID and the students seemed more engaged. A challenge I've experienced is fostering belongingness and community when units are delivered in flexible mode where we accommodate both face-to-face and online students. Any tips for fostering a sense of community and engagement when accommodating both modes of delivery within one unit? Gavan, you look as though you're ready to jump in.
Well,
there.
all I would say is that I think that facilitating, we're calling that high flex, or that what I believe you're describing there is a modality where you're teaching online and face-to-face at the same time. If that's what we're talking about, we're a term that's being bantied about here is high flex, and I just think that that's an order of magnitude much more difficult than any kind of in-person or full stop or online or blended. The synchronous blending is incredibly difficult, and it has benefits, but it has to be with the right learning, with the right learners. High flex as a mode was as I understand it, was piloted with graduate students, so you have a group of students who are self-directed more or less, who have intrinsic engagement and who have other requirements perhaps to make a decision about whether they want to be on campus or online. Certainly undergraduate students can be intrinsically motivated, engaged, and have other requirements, but it's not to the same degree. And so I'm sympathetic, and in fact have been spending a lot of time over the past couple of weeks dissuading colleagues at my institution to consider a high flex or synchronous approach, synchronous online face-to-face approach for our coming for September, because of the barriers, and I'm always focused on the student learning experience. It's not that it's impossible, it's just incredibly difficult. So I'm making faces because I'm sympathetic to the challenges that it provides, and I see it. I'll just close by saying we pivoted from face-to-face to online and remote, and I see this as just yet another pivot, and I don't see my colleagues as being really prepared, not because they're not engaged, but simply because there's general exhaustion.
Okay. Any final comments that people would like to make with regard to that?
So I'll jump in there, Judyth. I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's around that kind of mixed mode delivery where you have half the class online and half the class in the classroom. And I know that the jury is out on whether that is doable without a lot of professional development for the teacher and the facilitator. I think, any of us, and many of us have probably experienced meetings where we've had half a room full of people and half a room in Zoom chats. And it's very easy to ignore one half of the room or the other. So there's a very deliberate need to make sure that everybody, regardless of the mode of engagement, is addressed. And that actually takes quite a thoughtful kind of approach to what you're doing in the room. And you have to design, I suppose, the activities in such a way that you are actually inclusive of both modes. In some ways, the real simplistic answer is if you design it right so that your online students have a great experience, then your classroom experience will probably be okay as well. But I think it is a really deliberate piece of work to get that right.
Thank you. And look, we're now past the hour, and so I'm going to have to close off. Can I apologise to the people who have made comments and asked questions that I haven't been able to get to? Clearly, our members of the panel have been very. I thought we were finished. We've got a few more minutes, so it gives me a chance to ask a couple more questions. Then, so let me. So we've got until 15:15. I thought we were finishing at 10 our time. So back to you, Sherman. RMIT is a large and diverse institution. In fact, I think it's, along with Monash, they're the two largest universities in Australia, but yours is even more complex because of its dual sector, that is technical and further education and universities for those people who are not in Australia. So can you describe some of the interventions and strategies, and you started on it then, that have been put in place to foster belonging within diverse populations, and how you measure the effectiveness of these strategies? So often in universities we do stuff, but then the measuring to see what the value add, what the impact is left, because there's the next project to get onto. So can you give us a sense what's happening at RMIT?
I'll flag a couple of things that we're doing, and I will acknowledge that I think Rachel's on this call, because I saw her name in a chat. But one of the big projects that has been part of RMIT for a number of years, and it predates me, is a thing that's called the Belonging Project. And Rachel Wilson and Bronwyn Clark from the university did a lot of work, a lot of research to build a very academic approach to what belonging looked like. And the idea was to really embed belonging as an aspiration right throughout what we did in the whole university. And that belonging happens at a number of levels. One, it was around the institution. Secondly, it was around the discipline. And then thirdly, it was around the expected profession of the learner. So there was effort made to really make sure that there was that institutional belonging, and whether it's what Chris would call that pedagogical warmth, or that social experience, or the friendship building, or that sense of, yes, I am an RMIT student, both in the formal learning and the informal social experience, and then a discipline belonging through the formal learning, but also through engagement with academics who are outside the classroom, through events and research activities, et cetera, and then finally that professional belonging through professional and community engagement, as well as the classroom. So work integrated learning partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. So a very, very kind of holistic approach to what belonging would mean for a learner. We were working towards what the university had called euphemistically the B score, which was a measure of metrics which we saw as belonging indicators. And we just got to the point where we were kind of rethinking what that B score looked like, because it seemed a bit blunt and simplistic, and instead trying to unpack the actual indicators themselves to give our academics and teaching staff a more nuanced view about what was working or not. And we were right in the middle of that when COVID hit. And unfortunately, our priorities went elsewhere, because there was as some might remember, a bit of a pivot last year, and everyone's resources kind of got diverted. So that's a project that's still in work in progress. We are coming back to it, but that's something that we tried to embed right across the institution. The second thing that I want to flag is, and it speaks to, I think, Bev's thoughts earlier around the differences between our cohorts. And yes, there's kind of the quite stark difference between what we might think of as the traditional undergraduate learner, what I call euphemistically the filling the gap between adolescence and adulthood, where those kind of like school leavers then go on to uni and then onto their careers, and then quite separately our lifelong learners, who are largely working, perhaps looking for a career change or some career uplift. But even within those cohorts, we know that there's a lot of diversity. And so we did quite a lot of work to try and understand the diversity of those cohorts, and came up with, and I'm sure every university has done very similar things, the different personas around those activities. But where I think we did a little bit more was we tried to look at the transformation of those personas as students progress through that learner journey. And what became very apparent through the interviews and focus groups and other work we did was that there was no fixed persona, that someone might come in with a particular idea and characteristic, And depending on how the university responded, reacted, made opportunities available, their learner persona would change and evolve. So they might come in as a career focused, just want to get the job kind of learner. And then depending on what happened, they might then evolve into, no, I actually want to explore a few new intellectual ideas and change my kind of mode and think about things differently. So there was kind of for me, a nuanced understanding of that learner journey and what actually happened throughout the stages of a student's life cycle, which then would of course become continual and go on. And the lesson learned from that for me is, you know, I almost hate the term, but it's kind of something that is used outside the sector as well. That notion of mass personalization. How do we understand those individual journeys, personalize the experience to make sure that we engage the students properly? But to your point, Judyth, with a big university, how do we do that at scale? And I think that's a work in progress. It makes me a little bit nervous because I'm someone who gets bombarded with Google ads for dishwashers the moment after I've done one search for a dishwasher. So I'm conscious that the notion of mass personalization is still a flawed one. But I think it's an aspiration for us to think about how we actually create that sense of belonging through those different opportunities for those different cohorts at scale. I'm not sure I totally answered your question, but those are the sorts of projects that we've been looking at. And we're looking at, you know, at the moment we're, in terms of measurement, we're probably relying a little bit too much on the traditional SES and internally our CES survey data, but we have also got a project to reinvent and look at the cradle to grave survey approach so that we get student feedback on a more continuous basis from the moment they indicate interest to the moment they end their 60-year curriculum with RMIT as the aspiration.
Gavan, what insights can you give to us about Canada in terms of what things have been put in place, not only in your university, but from universities that you have colleagues and friends in?
Yeah, I hate to speak for the whole country, so I'll just speak for my lived experience. At MUN, with the attempt to build belonging, we're really, you know, I like to think of levels of a system. So obviously, we're supporting faculty members and instructors with continuing professional development on how to facilitate these kinds of spaces. I'm also, I think it's really important to consider how if we look at what those hallmarks of connection are, and you know what the literature says about how students feel seen and recognized as a contributor or as a part of a community, and that builds a sense of community. Considering how we can use technology to address and engage learners. So, you know, one really minor example is our learning management system does a really great job of, through its analytical power, noting when students are disengaging. And so we've been working with faculty members to encourage them to create automatic messages that are personalized, not the same mass personalization that Sherman was speaking about, but rather personalized messages. So, dear Gavan, I noticed that you haven't submitted assignment X, and then provide some kind of affirmative message that, you know, I've got faith in your. This is not what I would write, but in a sense, communicating within the fact that the student has the ability to complete this work and that you're, as an instructor, available for them. That manages a little bit of the labor that I hear that we have concerns about, and that I saw in the Q&A around how we manage being a warm and caring faculty member while also having a whole host of other responsibilities. So we've been working with faculty to use those kinds of tools to help foster that connection. But then there's larger work that happens across the institution where we're working closely with our student affairs group to really see connection as existing within the classroom, outside the classroom, and throughout the entire institution. So that's happened this year with, I don't think any of this is particularly revolutionary, but it's incremental and little pieces matter. So I would say we've been doing town halls where we engage students. We've been asking students about their learning experience through direct surveys, and then communicating with them about how that's changed our approach to the upcoming semester. And then we've been asking students to connect with one another through tools that we have. We've got an application that allows students to find study buddies. And in fact, this little app that we have for students' phones allows them to say, hey, I'm studying this, I need to find somebody else, and it connects them. That's the most used feature in this app that we have for students. So I would just say that we're growing, we're focusing on the classroom, but then acknowledging that there's a larger web of relationships that we need to build as far as belonging is concerned. And not forgetting that the technology can help us in some regards.
Bev, you have presented yourself as the person that's both an insider and outsider, and I'm the same. I'm an insider and outsider. What sort of broad reflections and observations are you making about the state of learning and teaching in universities, and what the future might look like?
Thanks, Judith. I think we as the staff in universities need to look outside our own bubble to who the learners really are, as I said before. And I'll just say that you started this panel discussion by referring to the QUILT data. This is the National Australian data on the quality of learning and teaching. And also I think Sherman mentioned SES, which is the Student Engagement Survey. And while those surveys are limited in their usefulness, I would encourage people at their own, whether in Canada or elsewhere in the world, but here in Australia, don't just look at the overarching figures, go down and look at the item level data. And I think what you'll find there, it's all available on the web. What you'll find there, if I go back to Chris's point at the beginning, Chris talked about, seeing it, being an educator as a vocation. I agree with him. I just, it's something I can't give up. I'm still an educator. The fundamentals the students have been telling us about, and doesn't matter how old or young they are, the message is clear over years and years of data. They want an engaging relationship with their teacher. Now that's really hard when the industrial settings in Australian universities, often governed by academic workload models, actually quantify all the time you spend engaging with students or giving them feedback on their work. They want actually really good feedback on their work. They want to feel that someone cares and is interested in them. I always think the fundamentals of teaching and learning have not changed, and I don't think they will. Even though we live in a hybrid world, this is the way we're going to interact for a long time to come now. The world has fundamentally changed. But the fundamentals of education have not. So I think they are the things that we need to keep looking at, and to go back to that, those basic questions about who are these learners, what do they want to achieve, how can I help them do it? But that's going to take a great effort in very large corporatized universities where it's almost like the settings are in concrete. The LMS is in concrete, very difficult to change an LMS. The workload models are in concrete. So it's going to take a huge effort to get universities to become, as agile and user-friendly as they need to be. So that's my inside and outside view, Judith, that even though it's tough going and it's a lot of the environment is hardwired, the fundamentals are pretty clear, and that's what we need to keep coming back to. Student learning, student success.
What a great set of words for us to finish. Now I do have the time corrected. It's now 10:15 our time. I apologise to our New Zealand colleagues that I forgot to acknowledge them. So a belated welcome to our New Zealand colleagues. Look, finally, we would welcome people to complete the evaluations at the end of this webinar. But we'd also like some suggestions for some future ideas about topics that we could have for webinars for the rest of the year. I think that it's really important that we co-produce both the content of these and that we co-produce the experience. So look, I want to thank our fabulous team of panelists today. Today has been a great discussion. So thank you for your extending your day, Gavan. Thank you for your taking yourself away from your marking, Chris. And Sherman, of course, I'm sure you've missed a couple of meetings. So may you all travel safely and may you all continue to be well. And thank you for participating in what I think has been a terrific conversation. Goodbye to you all.
Thanks, Judyth.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.